is quantum mechanics? Cats being alive and dead at the same time? How we could teleport if we were really tiny? Is it something about time crystals? I'll be honest, quantum mechanics is pretty complicated, and we will be getting into it, I promise. But first, what if I told you that feminist physicists have been trying to draw attention to the fact that there's a secret history of quantum mechanics that, if taken seriously, could upend our understanding of objectivity, science, and the nature of reality itself? Wouldn't it be cool if we had a physicist here to talk about it? So first, a disclaimer. I'm going to be talking a lot about what it means for something to be true or real, and I want to be absolutely clear that even though I might argue that these terms are a little fuzzier than we'd like to imagine, that does not mean that science is not valuable. Maybe science is objective, maybe it's not, but either way, this is not a justification of anti-scientific claims. So don't get it twisted. Climate change is real, we are in a pandemic, science is not fake. We can criticize scientific institutions in order to improve them and not just tear them down. Anyways, before we get into the trippy reality questioning fun part of the video essay, we're gonna have to do a little bit of homework. To try to make it not feel like homework, I'm going to keep things simple and only give a very bare bones explanation of what the uncertainty principle is. So do not come at me in the comments telling me, oh, actually it's momentum, not speed. I know it's momentum. It's a metaphor. Go touch grass. I promise the simplified version will give enough of an understanding of the physics for us to have a little bit of fun with the philosophy. So in general, quantum mechanics is the part of physics that describes the smallest things that we're aware of. Subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, the little things. It also describes how these things interact with light, but that's complicated, and we're going to keep it basic today. We're going to keep it simple. We're just going to start with one proton. At any given time, the proton presumably has a position, where it is in space, and a speed, how fast it's moving. Let's say we have a device that can measure either of those properties, and we use it to measure the proton's speed. We write down the speed, and then we use it again to measure the proton's position, and we write that down, and then, because we're good scientists that repeat our trials, we go and measure the speed again. And this is where things start to get strange. This time, we find that the speed is different than it was the first time we measured it. And we haven't done anything in between the two measurements of the speed, except for measure the position. This quantum weirdness is the result of what is called the uncertainty principle. Introduced by Werner Heisenberg in 1927, the uncertainty principle tells us, mathematically, that we can only precisely measure the position or the speed of a particle, not both. And that by measuring one of them precisely, for example, the speed, we necessarily lose the precision in the other, the location. And technically, this doesn't actually just apply to particles. Theoretically, any object obeys the uncertainty principle. It's just that for normal-sized things, the uncertainty created in the speed or position is just too small for it to really matter. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, technology advances, maybe one day we'll have devices that can measure both of those things at the same time. I hate to break it to you, but as far as we're aware right now, the laws of physics put some pretty hard limits on what we are able to know, regardless of the advancement of technology. We can make spaceships that go faster and faster, but they can never go past the speed of light. We can build telescopes that let us look farther and farther into space, but we can never look past an area that we understand to be the observable universe. And we can try really hard, but we can only precisely measure a particle's speed or its position. The other one has to remain uncertain. Physics says so. It's kind of like this joke that physicists like to tell where Heisenberg gets pulled over by a cop for speeding, and the cop asks him, do you know how fast you were going? And Heisenberg's like, nope, but I know exactly where I am. And then the cop says, well, you were going 100 miles per hour. And then Heisenberg goes, great, now I'm lost. This is why all cops are bastards. Now, the math is pretty straightforward. As far as I'm aware, nobody's arguing about the math. The math is fine. But physics is not just math. Physics uses math in order to say things about the real world. While math is hanging out in complex space with imaginary numbers, physics is about reality. So what does the uncertainty principle say about reality? You might have learned about the uncertainty principle as a limit on what we can know. If we know a particle's speed, then we cannot know the position, and if we know the position, we cannot know the speed. It's a statement about the scope of possible knowledge. Obviously, the particle has a position and a speed at the same time, but regardless of how advanced our technology gets, we cannot know both. Enter Niels Bohr, who won the 1922 Nobel Prize in Physics for his work in atomic structure. Now, Bohr is generally considered to be one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, but the way that he understood the uncertainty principle is pretty at odds with the way that it's generally taught today. And it wasn't just him. At some point, he managed to convince Heisenberg, the guy the principle is named after, of his hot take. And what was this hot take, you ask? What is the quantum mechanical T? Instead of saying that we cannot know a particle's position and speed at the same time, Bohr believed that a particle cannot have a defined position and speed at the same time. It's not about what we can and can't know. For Bohr, it was a question of what is and what is not. As far as Bohr is concerned, it just doesn't mean anything to say that a particle has a position before you've measured it, or any characteristic for that matter. The only thing that exists for Bohr is measurements. We can take measurements and we can say what the result of those measurements were, but according to him, the measurement is not an objective observation of the particle's nature. Instead, it's the specific interaction between the particle and the observer. Bohr believed that quantum mechanics wasn't a description of reality so much as a way to predict the outcomes of measurements. And the difference there is subtle, but it's important. Think of it this way. If a tree falls in the middle of a forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? We could say that a tree falling produces vibrations in the air whether or not there are people around to hear it, so yes, obviously it does make a sound. But we could just as easily say that sound isn't just pressurized airwaves, it's when those pressurized airwaves travel through the air and then hit somebody's eardrum and then their brain translates it into the experience of sound. So Bohr might say that the tree that falls with no one around to perceive it does in fact make a sound. And if you think about this, Bohr was saying something that should have absolutely been revolutionary to our understanding of physics. An observation cannot be separated from their observer. In other words, there is no objective, observer-independent reality. It doesn't exist. But if a forefather of the field was pushing this take, why doesn't anybody know about it? How did I spend a whole decade studying physics without hearing about any of this? Why do so many people think that science produces objective truth? Why does physics collectively ignore Bohr's interpretation, even though Heisenberg himself eventually was convinced of it? To answer these questions, we have to understand the classical physics worldview and see why Bohr's interpretation completely upended it. Before quantum mechanics came along, we had classical mechanics, sometimes also called Newtonian mechanics after Isaac Newton. Classical mechanics is the physics that describes stuff like apples falling off trees and planets orbiting stars. Newton was an English scholar of the Enlightenment, an era characterized not only by Europeans finally catching on to the whole science thing that the Arabs, Indians, and Chinese had been doing for centuries, but also by specific beliefs about the nature of observers and the things that they observe. In other words, the relationship between scientists and the things that they study. In the classical worldview, the observer and the observed are entirely separate entities that do not interact. Objects of study, like apples or planets, have properties like size or position that do exist and are definite, regardless of whether or not there's somebody there to observe them. The goal of physics, then, is to describe this observer-independent reality, what truly is. In Bohr's worldview, however, there are no inherent properties of objects. There are just interactions between things. It's kind of like this idea in sociology that communication is society. Not that communication happens in society or describes society, but that the communication itself is what makes society. And as we all know, we live in a society. I'm gonna get back to that though. Society is the communication. Similarly, the measurement is the interaction. When an observer measures something about an object, the observer and the object are co-creating the observation. It's a group effort. Teamwork makes the dream work. Bohr called these observation-creating interactions phenomena and said that as far as humans are concerned, phenomena is all there really is. For Newton, measurements were a stepping stone to understanding true reality. But for Bohr, the measurement is the end of the line. So we can see a shift from the Enlightenment scientific worldview that dominated Europe since the 17th century to the quantum worldview that was beginning to develop in the 1900s. For my viewers over 21, have you had a Gen Z kid describe the time you were born as the 1900s yet? It's interesting. But despite the mathematical rigor of the uncertainty principle, the experimental evidence that supports it, and the relative prestige of quantum mechanics as a field, I do think that most physicists today would probably align themselves with the objective, rational Newtonian worldview and roll their eyes at the limp-wristed kumbaya, we're all connected take that Bohr was pushing. Which is wild, right? Like, we basically have a robust argument for the fact that there is no objective reality, scientifically, but we're still teaching students the uncertainty principle while simultaneously Jedi mind-tricking them into thinking that science is objective, actually. It turns out that physicists are really invested in maintaining the appearance of objectivity, and we're gonna get back to that. That's important, so put a pin in it. For now, let's just say that the uncertainty principle was contorted into the classical worldview, and everybody basically forgot about Bohr's interpretation. And they all lived objectively ever after. Or they would have, if it wasn't for those goddamn feminists. So this whole analysis comes from Dr. Karen Barrett, who I think can best be described as physics' Judith Butler. Barrett's a quantum physicist, philosopher, and scholar of feminist studies who's argued that Bohr's forgotten interpretation is actually pretty consistent with modern feminist theory. And Barrett has this whole theory built on top of Bohr's ideas that uses quantum mechanics and what it says about knowledge to understand anything from ethics to politics, which honestly is fascinating, but I would need a whole other video to do it justice. And extra honestly, I haven't read the book yet. I learned about Barrett's ideas on a paper titled On the Possibility of a Feminist Philosophy of Physics. Can you imagine if I was trying to do this back when YouTube was all atheism bros talking about how feminists are causing the decline of Western civilization? So for a little context, the philosophy of science, be it geology, medicine, chemistry, whatever, attempts to answer questions like, what counts as science? How do we know science is right? What is the purpose of science? And feminist philosophy of science is that, but make it women. It's the girl bosses. Okay, for real though. As a field, feminist philosophy of physics is concerned with three main areas. Social practices, so how the community of physicists operates. Cognitive practices, how knowledge is constructed within this community. And theoretical practices, the actual meat and potatoes of what physics says about the universe. And importantly, the feminists are concerned with how the systematic lack of women in physics affects all of those things. Most people are at least kind of familiar with the social practices part. Like, in this, the year of our Lord 2022, you'd be pretty hard-pressed to find somebody who's missed the memo that science has at least a tiny bit of a cultural bias towards men. But the idea that this bias could affect the actual outcomes of physics, the theories that it produces, that's a bit spicier. All that stuff from before about Heisenberg and Bohr and the uncertainty principle, that falls under theoretical practices, the actual body of physics knowledge, right? Two people could derive the same mathematics that lead you to the uncertainty principle, but walk away with completely different understandings about what the math says about the real world. One person might say, sure, the quantum stuff's weird, but that doesn't change anything about objectivity for everything else. It's our tradition as men of science. While another person, perhaps one whose gender has historically been written off as the irrational one, might be a little more inclined to think that maybe knowledge reflects the perspectives of the people who create it. And that's the really cool thing about quantum mechanics as an area for philosophy, right? Because the things we're finding out aren't just new knowledge, but they're saying something about knowledge itself, about what we can know or what even exists. So even though we're talking about a theoretical practice, you can maybe see how it's starting to affect the cognitive practice. The particles are trying to tell us what we can and can't know, which is crazy in and of itself, right? But what I do think is slightly more interesting is how the theoretical and the cognitive spill into the social. Because, I'll be honest, when it comes to actually doing science, I don't think there's a difference between the person who subscribes to the Newtonian worldview and thinks that their research is absolute truth, and the person who's a little bit more skeptical of the whole objectivity thing. One of them might be a little bit more obnoxious in how they present their results. Think grandiose statements about revealing the truth of reality and nature and the universe. But I don't think their results would be meaningfully different. Kind of like how, despite there being this perceived conflict between science and religion, I don't actually think a religious person is any less capable of producing good scientific results than a die-hard atheist. I think the thing that is more meaningfully different between the Newton stan and the Bohr stan is how they relate to things besides their research. How they move through their life because of their beliefs about knowledge. And really importantly, how they think about people. Physics education researcher Dr. Ayush Gupta describes one of these options really well in an essay titled Discourse of Objectivity. In it, they talk about the difference between the way objectivity applies to the work of science and the distinct but related way that objectivity is used by scientists as a rhetorical device.
The discourse of objectivity denies the positionality of the speaker or doer as relevant, hides how one is interpreting even statistical data, creates illusions of rationality, and stymies the consideration of emotions, values, and ideologies in conversations.
Positionality? Emotions? Ideologies? You can probably see where I'm going with this now, right? In my experience, the belief in objectivity has a lot less to do with science itself and a lot more to do with who we trust to do science. Does this person have the air of a confident, rational truth teller? Well, they're going to be objective in their science. Give them a Nobel Prize. But a person who asks questions about the political context of science, or perhaps shows more emotion than a Vulcan, get her out of here before she bleeds on the lab equipment. Is that too gross? It's fine. This dichotomy is expressed really well by Dr. Chanda Prescott Weinstein, a theoretical cosmologist who's also a scholar of gender and women's studies. When did professional physics feminists become a thing? And why did nobody tell me about it before I wasted my 20s studying astrophysics? In a paper on what she calls white empiricism, Prescott Weinstein illustrates two ways in which modern physicists perform the appearance of objectivity to justify some pretty unscientific things. First, she talks about instances where physicists are basically willing to ditch the scientific method entirely. The example she uses here is quantum gravity. So, what's quantum gravity? Basically, two of the most celebrated theories in physics, quantum mechanics and general relativity, kind of contradict each other. Albert Einstein, who developed general relativity, famously said that God does not play dice with the universe, referring to the way that every cause has an effect in his theories about gravity. Mass exists, space-time bends. Cause, effect. But as it turns out, quantum mechanics is just kind of dicey. Like, as crazy as it sounds, quantum mechanics says that if I took this microphone and threw it at a wall, there's a small probability that it would just pass through the wall. This very clearly real microphone would just... Okay, so obviously the mic is not real, but it does make me feel like I'm singing a duet with the ghost of Ella Fitzgerald, and I love it, and I'm keeping it. So the microphone passing through the wall is not necessarily likely, but if you roll the metaphorical sextillion-sided die enough times, you'll eventually roll a 1. Science. To try to reconcile these two clearly incompatible crown jewels of modern physics, people came up with quantum gravity. If you've ever heard of string theory, this is basically that. The basic idea is that if you can construct a reality with 11 spatial dimensions, you can describe anything in terms of vibrations in a field, and that includes what we see in quantum mechanics and general relativity. Dope. Word. Let's fly. Tiny problem with that though. There's no evidence that we exist in a universe that has any more than 4 dimensions. String theorists 20 years ago were also saying that the Large Hadron Collider, you know, that big thing in Switzerland that theoretically opened up a black hole that's thrown us into an alternate timeline, they were saying that it would definitely find those supersymmetric particles that their theory needed to work. But the LHC has been online since 2008, and there's still no sign of them. Basically what I'm saying is there is no empirical evidence for string theory. And in case you're not familiar with the scientific method, remember that thing scientists love so much, the scientific method? Comparing theories to data is like half of it. Boy. Instead of actual data, there's a subset of string theorists that just say that the beauty and symmetry of the theory is convincing enough to ditch the overly constraining scientific method. Yeah, they're just like, no, screw it. It's not helpful. We moved past it. And as weird as that sounds, using beauty and aesthetics to justify scientific ideas is nothing new to the Western tradition of physics. Like, the ancient Greeks said that the stars had to be constant in their brightness, literally just because it would be so beautiful and elegant that way. Meanwhile, ancient Egyptians had already measured the time variation of the star system Algol to like 3 significant figures. Catch up. So with this example of quantum gravity, Prescott-Weinstein shows us that even the most prestigious areas of modern physics will tolerate blatant anti-empiricism when it's convenient. And I don't want to make it seem like all string theorists hate the scientific method. Like, I got friends that are string theorists. It is just a subset of them, but it's a subset that's taken seriously by the scientific community. And I kind of feel like that says something, right? On the other side of this coin, Prescott-Weinstein talks about how some physicists will absolutely insist on being objective when it comes to the possibility of letting Black people do physics. For decades, there have been countless studies documenting the systematic exclusion of Black folks from physics spaces, be they educational or professional. There's a veritable mountain of evidence demonstrating this. Hopefully there are now studies scrolling by on the screen that you could look to if you didn't believe me on this. There is a lot of evidence. There has been a lot of evidence for a long time. Despite this, there's a very particular experience that I imagine a lot of people of color in STEM can relate to. It looks like this. A non-white student or professional experiences racism in a setting like a physics department in a university. They try to report it to a probably but not necessarily white higher up and are immediately met with skepticism. Are you sure? Can you prove it? I've never experienced racism from that person, so you must have misunderstood. Prescott-Weinstein calls this selective application of objectivity basically as a rhetorical device, white empiricism.
It is reflected in the string theorists' ability to actively argue for continued investment in their ideas via funding and faculty hiring, while at the same time, Black people, particle physicists or not, are often considered to be making controversial or evidently wrong statements about racism.
Basically, while post-empirical string theorists are getting jobs for a theory that, again, requires 7 more dimensions than we are aware to exist, Black people, and particularly Black women who talk about discrimination, are written off as unobjective. And this logic isn't just limited to conversations about race. There's a really pervasive line of thinking in which, if a person isn't able to be objective about the people stuff, for example, whether or not they did in fact experience racism, then there's no way they'll be able to be objective in their research. And you can use Prescott-Weinstein's analysis here on any marginalized group you want. Again, there's a reason that it was feminists who have been questioning all this objectivity stuff in physics. Because women have historically been excluded from academic spaces on the basis of our delicate and subjective lady constitutions. Whatever kind of marginalization a person might experience in communities of scientists, the criteria of objectivity can be weaponized against them. I am so sorry, liberals. It just turns out you can't believe science and believe women. You're gonna have to pick one. Who's it gonna be? Okay, all this is starting to really bum me out. We're gonna wrap things up. So I already said that I don't think a person's belief in objectivity really affects the science they create. It might, it could. That could be an interesting question to look at another time, but for now I'm trying to be generous. I don't think a die-hard Newtonian rationality bro is incapable of designing experiments or interpreting data. I also don't think that my own skepticism of objectivity as a scientific ideal prevents me from building on top of the existing body of physics knowledge, unobjective though it may be. I only really care about this because I am so tired of the physicists who think that the perceived rigor of their field means that they can assert literally anything about anything and say that they're objective because science. And maybe that sounds kind of glib, but in all seriousness, the ideal of objectivity is pretty intertwined with some of the darker parts of science's history. Like, it's not a coincidence that the British Empire coincided perfectly with Europe's Age of Reason. And if you're over there thinking that scientifically justified acts of colonialism are a thing of the past, boy do I got a future video essay topic for you. And again, that's not to say anything about the way that the discourse of objectivity literally silences marginalized people in physics spaces. The whole objectivity thing is a mess. Like, it's a mess. Throw it away. But if the prospect of physics and science and everything not really being real, like, stresses you out a little bit, I'd kindly direct you to the words of gentleman and scholar CJDX from their video on objectively bad art.
Think of subjectivity as our emergency exit button that it opens a trapdoor and it drops us out of our objectivity conversation right back into all of our biases and the inevitability of interpretation, and we just keep this exit trapdoor button on hand, so as soon as our tools of objectivity hold us back rather than enable us to do more, we just...
So even though CJ is saying this in the context of an argument as to why art is objective, which feels kind of like the antithesis of me arguing that science is subjective, my dude's got a point. I sincerely think that this is one of the better takes I've heard about objectivity versus subjectivity. When you're measuring gravitational forces or preparing ensembles of particles, be as objective as you want. Unleash your inner Isaac Newton. Live your best rational life. But the second you start talking about people and not particles,
we just...
When physicists wield the authority of objectivity to marginalize people, they're holding the field back. We are being limited by an outdated understanding of what it means to know something, and that impacts the ability of the field to progress. What would it even be like if, instead of approaching everything with the stubborn insistence of objectivity, we approached the world with a more quantum view of knowledge? If we could understand that two things can be true at once? If we remembered that our experiences of the world are tied to the fact that we are people observing it. If we maintained enough humility to understand that there is uncertainty in literally everything. In these uncertain times, I can definitely see the appeal of that kind of thinking. It's nice. It feels good. It's easy. But me personally, I like to take solace in the fact that, cosmically speaking,
it's just a baby.
I can seek to understand what I can understand without having to assert that what I think I know is truth with a capital T. As Bohr said in response to Albert's bit about dice in the universe, it cannot be for us to tell God how he is to run the world. In other words,
I'm just a baby.
So if you've made it this far, thanks for watching. This is my first attempt at the whole YouTube thing, and I'm super excited to not look at all the comments. I think this is the part of the video where I would usually do like credits, but I don't really have any of those yet. So instead of that, I'll just say, if you liked what I'm doing here and want to see more of it, consider subscribing or leave a tip. Apparently there's a feature for that now. And as a reward for making it to the end of this lecture, basically, I'm gonna give you a little fun science thing, because science doesn't just have to be critique. So remember that stuff on quantum tunneling from earlier about how, like, if I threw something at a wall, there's some probability that it would just pass through because quantum weirdness? So that's a real thing. It's called quantum tunneling. It doesn't have a ton of places where you can actually see it happening in the real world, but there's one really cool example of where it actually matters. So I'm not a biologist, so hopefully I get this stuff right, but basically DNA is like, you know, strings of nucleotides connected, right? And those are all twisted up, and that's your DNA strand. But the two little pieces of information on either side of the strand are connected by a hydrogen bond, which is just like a proton that connects this stuff to that stuff. So each connection has like 2 or 3 hydrogen bonds. And those protons that form the hydrogen bond have some probability of just like teleporting to the next bond instead of staying where they are like they're supposed to, because quantum tunneling is a thing. And that might be a mechanism for mutation of DNA that is partly responsible for like all of the diversity of life that exists. Like, in order for there to be like many different types of animals and plants and fungus and whatnot, DNA has to mess up when it replicates. If it copies exactly perfectly every time, then there would only be one thing that existed. But instead it makes mistakes, and those mistakes get selected for, so we have everything. And that mistake can be caused by other things like heat or radiation or other random processes, but like quantum tunneling could be one of them. And I just think it's cool that this weird esoteric quantum magic thing is literally responsible for like the diversity of life. So that was fun. And now we've had fun. See, science can be fun. I can still enjoy science. Sometimes. Maybe. A little bit. God, grad school was bad.